This is North of Normal, a podcast about Canadian cinema and our relationship with film. My name is Andrew Hunter Scholey, and today we are discussing Ginger Snaps, released in the year 2000, directed by John Fawcett, screenplay by Karen Walton and John Fawcett. And on that note, today I am joined by Skylar Greencorn. Skylar.
Hello, everybody.
How are you?
I'm doing pretty good, actually, and I'm really excited to be here.
No, it's awesome to have you. I mean, when this idea for this podcast first came up, and I was approaching people if they would be interested in coming on and picking a film to talk about, a Canadian film, you immediately, right off the bat, without missing a beat, just said Ginger Snaps right away. You also said anything by David Cronenberg, specifically The Fly. Maybe we'll get to that on a future episode.
Absolutely. I certainly hope so.
I think Cronenberg and The Fly is going to come back up later on in this conversation as well. But you didn't even have to think about it. You immediately said this. Why is that?
If I'm being perfectly honest with you, Ginger Snaps for me is very personal as a horror film, just because growing up in a small rural community like I did, I'm for the audience's sake, I'm from a very small fishing community called Canso. It's on the easternly-most tip of Nova Scotia. You basically drive until you go over a cliff. That's kind of how that works. Population of about 600 to 800, very small, obviously. Growing up, I didn't really have access to a lot of content, to be perfectly honest. We didn't have a movie theater. We didn't have much of any distribution of like any DVDs or I guess Blu-rays didn't exist at that time. DVDs, VHS tapes, those things were not readily available to me all the time. So my movie consumption was actually very minuscule. So I guess with Ginger Snaps for me is personal because it came at a time when I was starting to really, really fall in love with cinema, if that makes sense.
No, definitely. But I mean, did you discover this while you were in Canso? And thank you for describing Canso, because I've only been there the once. Actually, it is when we met, was for a wedding, and Canso's a pretty trippy place.
It is a little bit of a culture shock.
It's hard to articulate what it is. But no, I'm glad you went out of your way because, I think the sort of themes of isolation in a community is something we're going to tackle. So I'm glad you got that out of the way.
Absolutely.
So where did you actually discover Ginger Snaps? So was it in Canso?
It was actually. So absolutely. I'm glad that you actually brought that up because basically growing up, we had a corner store that was pretty much our only accessibility for renting or purchasing any movies. So there was a little corner store not far away from where I lived that rented out new and used DVDs. This was at a time where I was starting to really get involved in the filmmaking process, and inevitably that would lead to a career shift for me, like a career choice. For those who don't know, I have a visual effects background, so I actually studied CGI and visual effects in school, and a lot of that came from an undying love for cinema. Growing up. So Ginger Snaps for me is personal because it's one of the first DVDs I ever rented that was in the horror genre. And that's obviously, for those of you who know me, very specific and also very important as an inspirational standpoint for me. And notwithstanding the fact that it's a Canadian film. Ginger Snaps I rented by myself just because I wanted to try something new. It appealed to kind of a side of me that I wasn't even aware existed at that time, which was, I was about 12 or 13, I think.
So you just rented it blind?
Pretty much.
You knew nothing about it ahead of time?
Didn't see a trailer.
Saw that cover with the two girls and that blurry picture and you just went with it?
Pretty much. I mean, it was at that phase. I was 13 or 14 years old, I think. And I'm at that age where I'm starting to take notice of girls and move into that adolescent period. And obviously a topic that needs to be discussed, and I'm sure you'll cover this about Ginger Snaps, is this whole transition from childhood to adolescence. That plays a big role in the movie's design, if I have to be so bold as to say. I mean, it's very obvious.
Yeah, I kind of sum up Ginger Snaps as having three major themes to it. Suburban alienation, adolescence, and, well, the elephant in the room, menstruation, is the third major one.
Totally.
And, the fact that this is about two girls makes it very unique in the horror world. Now, before we move into Ginger Snaps, you mentioned, the work that you're doing right now. Just to explain where you're coming from with this, like what are you doing now? Who is Skylar?
So Skylar, I guess I kind of do a lot of things. I'm a college instructor. I teach animation and visual effects at Maritime Business College. I also freelance locally as well. I do a lot of, I guess in my spare time, it ranges, to be honest with you, commission-based work, digital art, everything from video games to, I guess, just run-of-the-mill like commissions for people. And also, as of recently, this year, to be more specific, I'm co-founder of a up-and-coming production company, which is actually the umbrella that houses this network. It's Eldritch Creative. And we directed, myself and my other co-founder partner, Hallie Walsh, we directed and shot our first short film titled Guardian, which is in the process of being submitted to film festivals and finding screenings and all that good stuff. And it was one of the most rewarding experiences I know of my life. And it ties into Ginger Snaps really well, because the way I watch Ginger Snaps now versus when I was growing up is very different.
Yeah, I have something to add to that as well. My background with the film is, well, a little bit different than yours. See, I grew up the opposite of you. I grew up, well, the best way to put this, I hadn't seen this movie since I had rented it from a Blockbuster in Etobicoke, Ontario, probably a couple of years after it came out. It was a movie that I, had heard word of mouth about, and then I picked up a book by screen critic Richard Krause, where he really sang praises about this film. It was all about, it was one of those 100 best movies you should see before you die, but he really wanted to put, a focus on Canadian cinema in it. So when I read that article, I went out and rented it, and the Blockbuster, like I said, where I rented it from, actually had a pretty decent selection of movies. The guy who owned it must have, known what he was talking about. And just picked up the VHS, watched it, and I haven't watched it since. Not because I didn't like it, but as you know about me, I tend not to revisit films a lot. I'm kind of always moving on to the next thing. Mm-hmm. So I just I watched it, I liked it, and went on with my life. And now it's like 15, if not, about 15 years later, I put this thing on, and let me tell you, it was a trip. Ginger Snaps was filmed in Brampton, Ontario, Etobicoke, where I said that Blockbuster was, and Scarborough, just on the other side of downtown Toronto there. I am from Brampton, Ontario. Watching this was an acid trip, jump back in time. If you wanted to know what my high school looked like, you press play on that DVD. That setting, those neighborhoods, the way people look at like in the schools, it was absolutely bizarre. I've always said that Richard Linklater's film Suburbia best represented my teenage years, but it takes place in Texas. If you take Suburbia and mash it with the visual of Ginger Snaps, you almost have a perfect recreation of my high school. So it was a very bizarre viewing experience, because when I first watched it, it was only a few years out of high school for me. So things just looked like that. But now I've lived, in 3 different provinces. And like I said, it's almost 15 years later. It was just a very jarring experience for me, I have to say, and kind of lent itself into that theme of suburban alienation. Because when we talk about these themes, you get me going about suburban alienation, and I can go on for hours. I couldn't get out of that place fast enough. And their feelings of resentment to that area, I'm like, I completely understand, because that was literally where I was at that time, like exactly where they filmed it. Who is it? The character of Sam Miller, played by Chris Lynchy. He went to a local high school. We're around the same age. Friends of mine were in classes with him. So, literally, it doesn't even just look like it was literally filmed where I went to high school with these people.
Well, the school aspect of it is actually really fascinating, because that led to severe amounts of issues with the filming. Because for those who don't know, Ginger Snaps actually, they shot that over 6 weeks roughly.
Yeah, I believe like November leading into December or something.
Oh, it was brutal. And and this is kind of leads into my experience watching it now versus then. We had a 3 or 4 page script that we adapted earlier this year, Guardian, as I mentioned, and making that 12-minute film, we saw firsthand just how much work goes into just 2 days of filming. This movie took place over 6 weeks, has it's almost like its running time is basically almost 2 hours. So you can assume that there was well over 2 hours of footage shot. Lots of effects, it's a very ambitious movie for Canadian cinema, because I rewatched it and I was shocked at just how much effort and content was put in that you would otherwise wouldn't get for funding for this kind of a project, especially in 99, where they're on a location scouting mission during, I guess, right after the Columbine shootings.
Well, yeah, the Columbine shootings and specifically the Tabor, Alberta shootings that happened shortly afterwards. And yeah, it did cause a lot of controversy, specifically about why our tax dollars were going into this schlock of a film. It weirdly echoes David Cronenberg back in, I think, was it 77 or 78 when he made Shivers? That caused a lot of controversy as well at the time. So it seems to be this sort of thing resonating through this period of Canadian cinema where people are being very choosy about what they think should or shouldn't get funding. And to Telefilm Canada's credit, they didn't pull out their funding. They stood behind the film and things went on. The hardest thing that they had was finding a casting company that would actually step in and actually, try to find people. Apparently that was the biggest hurdle that they had to get, or overcome, I should say.
Yeah, absolutely. The people that they actually originally were planning on auditioning for this movie, I remember reading through it, and there was actually a pretty astounding cast of people. The characters in this movie were almost played by some very well-known actors today, and honestly, I don't think I can picture those two characters being played by anybody else.
Absolutely.
My love for Catherine Isabelle, actually, in particular, directly stems from this movie, because again, going back to like where my upbringing was and me being by myself, I had some money that was given to me for my birthday or something. I wasn't quite old enough to go out and earn my own living, or even have a part-time job. So here I am. I actually spend some of what little money I had to go rent this movie that I knew nothing about, didn't see a trailer. And it was a life-changing experience in a lot of ways, because it reinforced a love for horror cinema and genre cinema in general, because I started paying attention to things, namely the werewolf itself and the transformation over time between with the characters.
And the practical effect nature of it as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because this was about the same time that I was really getting involved with understanding A, how CGI works, and B, when to use it effectively, because things like Jurassic Park had been out for, I guess, well over 7 years at this point. So obviously I was very young when that was released, and I wasn't even allowed to watch Jurassic Park, which is baffling to think of, considering I picked up Ginger Snaps when I was 13 or 14.
I'm exactly the same way. My dad wouldn't let me watch 18 when I was a kid, but he was totally fine letting me sit there and watch The Godfather.
Oh, so, fair enough.
Yeah, and having nightmares for weeks about horse heads in bed. So.
Oh, good Lord! Yeah.
What was going through our parents' minds when they censored what we were watching? I have no idea.
Yeah. And actually, now that I think about it, and the audience can check in on this if they want to dig into this a little bit, I'm pretty sure Natasha Lyonne was originally supposed to be casted as in the lead role as Ginger.
That was not a sigh of frustration. I love Natasha Lyonne, and as much as I love her, I think Catherine Isabelle is definitely a better pick. But that's fascinating. I was going to ask you, maybe off mic, if you had any idea who was casting it, because I didn't come across that.
Yeah, that was the biggest. That was the biggest one that I noticed, actually.
Because would that have been before or after American? But that would have been after American Pie. No, maybe just before.
It would have been
American Pie. I think was.
It would have been right around the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, let's go back and talk about influences on this. We talked about The Fly. There were a number of movies that kind of came up when I was thinking about this that I looked at. Now, the director here, John Fawcett, has openly cited the biggest influence that he had and the sort of impetus for him to want to make this was actually Peter Jackson's Heavenly Creatures.
Oh, weird. I didn't know that. That's really interesting.
Yeah, basically about the closeness of these two young girls in Heavenly Creatures and kind of what goes awry when they try to separate them. He found very interesting. And it's kind of almost like Heavenly Creatures mashed up against The Fly, with a little bit of Dead Ringers and Carrie thrown in.
Right.
It's this really it's almost one of those movies that it has so many different influences, it becomes its own thing. That you can see the sort of bits and pieces there. Specifically, the body transformation of The Fly, how it happens over a long period of time and initially empowers Ginger. At first, it's that whole metaphor of she gets bitten by the werewolf the same day that she first has her period. Mm-hmm. And, she all of a sudden, as a metaphor for, female sexuality becomes this sort of empowered sexual being almost overnight. And what that does, and that's where it kind of ties into Cronenberg. I think the next film he did after The Fly, Dead Ringers, about the two brothers that are very, very chaste. And then when one of them discovers that he has an attraction towards a woman, the sort of what that plays with their relationship as well. So really the center of this, aside from the horror aspects and the body horror aspects, are really about the relationship between the two sisters. And one thing that I found fascinating on this watch is that you could still have a really good movie if you took away the werewolf stuff.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
My favorite parts of the movie are actually the first half hour.
Oh my God.
Where it's them interacting and stuff like that, and exploring the two sisters in their home life. We haven't even talked about the intro to this movie, which is one of the best intros of all time.
I was actually just
talk about influence about movies. I immediately go to Harold and Maude.
Right.
This youthful obsession with suicide and death, and not actually engaging with it, but toying with the concept of it.
Yes.
And I mean, that wasn't me as a teenager, but I definitely knew people.
See, that was actually kind of me in a weird way, or at least it would lead to an inevitable fascination with death. So I really related to these characters on a level that I didn't expect. They were almost like an exaggerated representation of what was going to come for me as an individual in the next year or two after seeing it. And I remember seeing it and being genuinely disturbed by the opening, because there's this, for the audience, what happens basically is a slideshow presentation. It's kind of amazing. The two lead characters, the two sisters, the Fitzgeralds, are absolutely obsessed with the idea of death. They actually almost it's kind of a fascination on a level where they're not even really consciously caring about their own deaths.
Well, I mean, the most famous line out of the whole movie is the mantra that they share.
Yes.
The out by 16 or dead in the scene, but together forever.
Right.
They have this, they have this suicide pact. And when I was rewatching it, I was kind of thrown off, because I was are they supposed to be twins? Because it had been a long time since I had seen it, but there's only supposed to be a year difference between them. Just Bridget has skipped school.
That's right.
Or not skipped a grade, I should say.
Yeah. Which is interesting, because I think the two actresses, Emily Perkins is a little older.
4 years older.
Yeah. And
that's what I came across,
and she's playing the younger sister, which is interesting. But when it comes down to it, you think about a lot of even modern Hollywood movies, and the kindred connection that's developed between these two characters in just 10 to 15 minutes of the movie is so powerful and so strong that I would be hard pressed to see someone not immediately have a reaction to that, on some level or another.
It is honestly one of the best scene setting introductions in a film I've ever seen.
Yeah.
You get everything you need to know about these two girls. You get the tone for the film. And even though it doesn't really lean into that, it is something that pops up. It's almost like a polemic at the beginning of the film. It's taking the most extreme thing that you possibly can and throwing it into the audience's face. So for the rest of the movie, you just almost buy anything.
Oh yeah, the opening credits just showing these two girls position themselves in the most horrific means of suicidal or other means of death. It's the most gruesome opening, but also satirical in a weird way. It's fascinating, because it immediately ends with the slideshow projection stopping, and there's almost
the cut to the classroom, and all the other kids loving it with a horrified teacher.
Yes,
I love that.
It's so good.
That is so amazing.
And I love the teacher as well, because the teacher he's got
and he's a guy that you've seen through Canadian television over the years. I didn't get a chance to dive in and find out what that guy's done afterwards.
Well, as being an instructor myself and having seen some very choice artwork come hand into me, stuff where I could see the expression on his face and what's going through his head. And I relate to it so much, because sometimes you just get those students who are expressing themselves in a way that isn't exactly the most appropriate for perhaps, and you have to rein it in, but you have to find the right way to, facilitate the students and make sure that they're not being beaten down, and at the same time tell them that really wasn't okay. So you can see him in the performance really channeling this energy of I have no idea what to say to these two girls.
That's interesting. Yeah. Obviously, I don't have that point of view. I'm not a teacher, but that's really cool to get that point of view.
Yeah, this was in my rewatch actually that I noticed it, and I was just wow, what a great subtle, minuscule performance, but it was very noticeable to me.
Going back to the production of this film, actually, I'm just going to share a weird little fact that I stumbled across. Skylar, are you aware that the first werewolf film was called The Werewolf and filmed in 1913, and it was actually directed by a Canadian director called Henry McRae?
No.
Yeah, apparently it is lost. Apparently it was lost in a Universal Studios fire, but apparently a Canadian made the very first werewolf film, which is, I just figured nicely tied into this.
It really
there
does.
is actually a werewolf legacy. One thing I wanted to bring up is this movie has a really fascinating gestation period of a lot of people coming in. The one person who kind of gets overlooked a lot is Karen Walton, who co-wrote the screenplay with John Fawcett. John Fawcett kind of came up with the original idea and concept and wanted somebody on. And he approached Karen Walton, and she doesn't even like horror films. She was very much on the record of that, but he wanted that point of view that could get the sort of relationship like they had in Heavenly Creatures.
Yes.
So brought her in and convinced her. Now, she actually grew up. I don't think we've mentioned this. We live and record in Halifax, Nova Scotia. You did get out of Canso, in case anybody was curious.
I did, yeah.
Just went south a ways. And she grew up in Dartmouth, which is just across the harbor here, and moved to Edmonton in her teens. And that's what really influenced. She moved to a very suburban neighborhood, and that's what influenced the sort of ideas of the sort of suburban alienation that we have in here. But the biggest thing she brought in, obviously, aside from this character stuff, was the feminist commentary in here, which sets it apart from so many different, horror films in this genre and really makes it unique. So yeah, all of that stuff about the sort of suburban malaise and the people not caring all filters down from her experience of moving around a lot as a kid and not knowing people. And I just think that's really fascinating and really one of the most key components of this movie.
Yeah, totally. And to speak to that, actually, there's a very specific scene in this movie that capitalizes on that idea perfectly, which is, I think this is kind of a brilliant setup. It's an interesting concept. The presence of the werewolf in this suburban neighborhood is first depicted through the deaths of neighborhood dogs. And one of the first scenes in the film is actually this, this suburban mother stepping outside and screaming and wailing in pain because their dog has been mulched apart by this werewolf. And nobody cares. The kids are still playing hockey. There's a disingenuine, there's like a disconnect.
A numbness,
yeah. And it happens throughout the film where these dogs are just being ripped apart and no one is obviously they're putting papers up and enough for self-awareness sake, but no one seems to care. They still put their dogs outside because there's this disconnect in society where they're like, oh, well, it won't happen to me, right? It's kind of interesting.
Well, and there's a werewolf at the beginning of the film openly wandering around.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So yeah, that's definitely a valid point. And just the last thing, one thing that has fascinated me in the research of doing this show is how everything is interconnected, not just the influences. And I just wanted to share this one fact. We are going to cover Cube in the future.
Mm-hmm.
I friggin' love Cube. It is definitely going to happen. Vincenzo Natali, who was the screenwriter for Cube, did the storyboards for Ginger Snaps. Him and Karen Walton actually met at the Canadian Film Centre, which is in Toronto, started by Norman Jewison in 1988 to kind of connect film goers. So they were writing the screenplays for Cube and Ginger Snaps at the same time.
Whoa.
Literally across the table from each other. And apparently they both admit that they're both working next to each other really influenced the writing of the screenplays. And she specifically cited that being around him while he was writing Cube kind of punched up the script a little bit and kind of where a lot of that sort of quippiness comes from. Because I was saying to you before the episode, I was just going through pages and pages of quotes from Ginger Snaps, and this is a punchy script.
It really is.
It really does have great dialogue. So, and we're going to get to the special effects in a second, but yeah, I just can't, watching it this time, I just can't go on enough about how much I love this script.
Oh, it's fantastic. There's such an attention to detail about how teenagers spoke at that time. It's also just kind of a fireball of a script where the dialogue feels natural, but at the same time, there's a playful comedic tone to it that's kind of sprinkled in consistently. And I mean, for the audience's sake, this movie obviously garnered some success, namely overseas. It wasn't actually a big hit initially in Canada.
Well, it premiered at the Munich Fantasy Film Fest. This movie was actually really big in Germany.
Yeah.
And still has a really big following in Germany. And apparently that European market is why they could get funding for the sequels.
Absolutely. Because there is a sequel and a prequel that were actually shot at the same time that followed this. And it was entirely because of the cult status that this movie had garnered because of overseas success.
And also timing of when it came out. One important thing to bring about this release, because it was just handled poorly in Canada. Nobody wanted to touch it. They didn't know what to do.
Yeah.
It came out at the time that DVDs were just starting to take off. Mm-hmm. So it was a big release on that. And also at the very nascent period of the internet. So this had a really strong online presence. This movie, for obvious reasons, really resonated with young women. And they went on. This fandom is referred to as the Pack. Is what they refer to themselves as. I didn't know that before I started researching, but apparently It had a huge online presence, and that's what helped distribute it. If this movie had come out even like 3 or 4 years before, it probably would have been dead in the water in a footnote.
Totally. And it's kind of cool that just us two guys approaching this film that's very specifically catered to a female demographic, and we can still have such a strong impact.
But that's just something that I thought about a lot about this, is that I don't think it is catered towards women. It's just that this is subject matter that just doesn't get talked about or referenced.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And it shouldn't be that way.
Yes.
You know what I mean? I mean, I'm coming from a point of view, I was basically raised by 3 women.
Right.
So there is nothing taboo about, the subject of female adolescence and menstruation at all that is taboo, because it was openly talked about straight from when I was a little kid. But also I've gone to buy tampons for my girlfriend at the drugstore and been with dudes that wouldn't even go down the aisle with
Which
me.
is so strange. And I mean, obviously I'm coming at it from a different angle where I'm in a much more rural location growing up, but I was also surrounded entirely in my family households. It was mostly men. It was the male ratio was definitely stacked against my mom, unfortunately. But growing up, I actually had a closer kindred relationship to women. Most of my friends were girls. So this kind of in a weird way taught me a little something about females that I didn't really know about, which was another reason why it was particularly effective, because I didn't have that experience that you had.
Yes, of course. Just because we're a little bit concerned about time, and just because there were a couple of things I wanted to touch on super quickly. Number one, I just wanted to say to the audience that this podcast, these aren't one and dones. I would love to have a woman come on the show and address these situations, because I will be 100% honest, I don't feel 100% qualified for very obvious reasons. So if there is anybody that would like to come on and talk about this movie again, I am more than happy to revisit films and talk about them again in a heartbeat. I think it would be fantastic to explore those different things, because everybody brings something different to it. One thing I really want to touch upon really quickly is the production design, actually. Number one, I love the way that they dress people in this.
Totally.
Again, growing up in that exact area, that whole sort of layered goth look.
Yes.
Of just wearing, you're trying to look a little bit dark, but you still got to keep warm. And that look in it, I really love. The other thing that I love, and one thing that I really wanted to draw attention to, is the whole unfinished basement. Mm-hmm. And the half-builtness. These suburbs, when I grew up in Brampton, I grew up in an older neighborhood, so all the houses look kind of different. But they evolved into what you see in this film, these weird, sprawling subdivisions of just cookie-cutter houses. And oftentimes, it was like they just got them to the point of being livable, and then they're moving on to the next one. Mm-hmm. So you have these weird, unfinished basements. I would go over to friends' places that had basements that looked exactly like this. The design, which also was really trippy, that whole sort of faux 90s, that faux country thing that was going on, their house looks exactly like houses I would go to. And the unfinished basement I find really, really fascinating, specifically in how it plays out at the end of the film. What I find interesting, I'll be honest, the direction for most of the movie I find works. I don't think is exactly spectacular. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's trying to be.
No.
I think it's trying to be straightforward. But that end sequence, if we can jump to the end of the film where they're running around, what I find fascinating about that is that you start seeing corners of the room you've never seen before.
Yes.
You start seeing their living space at that point. And it becomes almost TARDIS-like.
Yeah.
Because it is way bigger than it should be.
The look of the house drastically changes. Mm-hmm. And there's a starkness, almost like a contrast that comes out of it, where suddenly the movie reminds you, oh yeah, right, we're a horror film. Because there are points in the movie where it does fall into more of like a young adult transitioning, bordering on comedy at points. But the horror gets sprinkled in, and when it does, it comes in like a freight train. It's so effective to the point where, going back and rewatching this, I was actually shocked how many scenes are burnt into my brain. And a lot of them actually come from that final sequence. There's some great jump scares. The look of the werewolf is burnt into my brain as well, of course.
Yeah, and like I said, the whole maze-like aspect of it, weirdly, it made me think of the Orson Welles lady from Shanghai, where if you haven't seen it, you've probably seen clips at the end where it takes place in a house of mirrors, and you have the whole thing about the guy, it looks like he's walking on, and you have the gunshot, and then it's just a mirror falling down. That whole maze-like aspect of it, I don't know. It might not have been an influence, but my brain definitely went there. Now that we're talking about the end of the film, this seems like a perfect place for you to talk about the design, because I know this is what is completely up your alley.
Oh, absolutely. Good Lord. The effects in this movie. Now, obviously, because of the time period, and it was in a time where effects were at a very strange stage. The Phantom Menace had just come out as well, where we have a movie that basically, it was a resurgence of a franchise that was pivotal in visual effects history, and then it's making a triumphant return. The green screen technology of the time was still very new. And for a movie like this to go into production, where they very easily could have fell prey to an aesthetic that is similar to the Phantom Menace, because coincidentally enough, some of the artists who were working in Europe on that movie actually came back to work on this one, which is interesting. It could have fallen prey to the CGI, and they strictly stated right from the get-go that they wanted this to be heavily makeup and practical effects oriented.
Yeah, I mean, you can't help but think about The Thing.
Oh, absolutely.
It's right up there.
Well, and kudos to Catherine Isabelle, and we didn't really talk too much about the performances, but good Lord, these two girls, these Vancouver-based women, are so talented, and they knocked this completely out of the park. Something that was on I guess it fits into production design and effects. Something I found out or discovered that stood out to me that I didn't realize: Emily Perkins shaved her head at one point prior to shooting this movie. You see that in the auditions. Yeah.
Where she has a really, really short hair.
Really short hair. And to the director's dismay, he obviously wasn't super keen on the idea, because the character of Bridget has very long, kind of dried out hair. They get a wig smith, or a really effective looking wig. I had no idea.
You cannot tell.
You can't tell at all.
Can I just say something about Emily Perkins' performance for a second?
Yeah.
Who plays Bridget, the younger of the two sisters. I was more blown away by her performance than Catherine Isabelle's as Ginger. At the beginning, playing the sort of mousy goth, which really was what most goths looked like in the sort of late 90s.
Oh, 100%.
Before it evolved into sort of a more stylish, attractive thing. Most goths that I knew were big sweater, dressed a lot like her. And she goes through a similar transformation as Ginger, but she doesn't have the makeup.
No.
It is all in body language. It is all in posture. Like I said, it's incredible. And I just wanted to touch upon that, because it's interesting that you do have these two characters going through transformations, and one is so physical and out there and over the top, and the other one is just completely through nuances and two completely different performances.
Absolutely. And I mean, they both had a big job in front of them. The characters that were playing were complex in a lot of ways and had to have a range over the entirety of the film. Catherine Isabelle's character, obviously, like Ginger, she has the most noticeable transition, and the whole point of the film is to acknowledge her transformation. She had to undergo 5 hours of makeup per day during the shooting of this, and something that really stood out to me in learning about the makeup in this movie, after doing our short film, which involved some makeup as well, continuity was a big issue on this movie, where they had somewhere upwards of a dozen or so different transformations of hair, facial prosthetics, and makeup.
God, I can only imagine.
Can you imagine? After doing what we did over 2 days and paying attention to every tiny little detail of where the stages of the makeup and at what point you need to be set up to look a specific way, and once you have that look, you can't reverse it very easily. It's so impressive.
Peek behind the curtains here. I was I did set design for Guardian, and I was also continuity, and That would be a nightmare.
It's
I cannot even imagine.
It's crazy. And like, notwithstanding the fact that you have issues that come along with makeup in general, like Catherine Isabel's like werewolf nails would fall off all the time. She had like permanent dyeing in her skin, like red dye that was like infusing into her skin because of all of the fake blood that was used in this movie.
Well, and the weird fact that I heard, the heavy prosthetics caused a permanent nasal drip.
Yes.
That in between takes she was cleaning with Q-tips.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Before we start wrapping things up here, unless you have more to say about the...
One last note.
Yeah, sure.
About the werewolf.
Yes.
That's kind of the big elephant in the room. The werewolf, obviously, there's a hokiness to it based on time period, but it was a giant animatronic, beautiful monster, and the evolution of this beast would actually change over the course of this, I guess, this film series, where the werewolf design actually alters and changes with each sequel and prequel. But this specific looking werewolf, it's the first time I ever saw like the idea of like a hairless almost looking werewolf. There isn't a lot of like hair or fur design. It's very almost like, it's got like a lot of wrinkles and folds. The way it moves and snarls is very fascinating, and how like they needed to have like 2 or 3 guys with remote controls to control just its face. So the amount of detail that was in the movement of this creature, and what minimal ways they did it, were really effective, in my opinion. Howard Berger, who very, very prolific practical effects artist, worked on things like Kill Bill and the Austin Powers movies and stuff, worked on this movie as well, which is really fascinating to note. One last note about production design as well. Sorry, this is like a weird tangent, because you were speaking about like the sets and how, I guess, realistic they were, and almost correlating that directly back to like our experience shooting our short film. I thought it was really interesting, the greenhouse scenes.
Oh yeah, they're cool.
They're really cool. The greenhouse scenes, you wouldn't believe it to look at them, because they're so convincingly well done. Because of the tightness of the timeline and the budget they had for this movie, they had to shoot over 6 weeks, like 16-hour days, so people were like really, really tired all the time. And there were a lot of scenes that were supposed to be in the script during the day. They actually shot a lot of the greenhouse stuff at midnight during the night, and what they basically built was a set that was kind of laced with these sort of gels that when you shoot a high-powered light through it, it gives it the illusion of daylight, which is
so
really
basically day for night.
Pretty much, yeah.
Kind of. A little different in the application, but basically what they're doing.
Yeah, which is a kind of just one more small, tiny little note to throw in there for design. Yeah,
definitely. Man, there's a lot that we didn't get to. We haven't even touched upon the parents.
Oh my goodness.
In this movie, Mimi Rogers, who plays the mom, she's amazing. Yeah, that's what I noticed doing research for this film. There is just so much to unpack.
Yeah.
You know, you could easily do a second episode.
Oh yeah,
just on everything in here. One thing I wanted to ask though, going back to the script for a second, do you have a favorite line or favorite moment from the film?
Oh goodness. It's kind of hard for me to pick, to be honest with you. I can at least point out the scenes that stood out to me the most. Was the idea of this abrupt werewolf attack in a playground, which I thought was an interesting setting.
Yeah.
That really stands out to me, and I remember it genuinely scaring me when I was younger. And then the werewolf also falling prey to being hit by a truck, and just the level of effects work that was done there, and of course the ending, like the finale, is really interesting. That the only other scene I can think of off the top of my head that really stands out is the authenticity of that teenage party sequence.
Yes,
it's very, very accurate in my opinion. Like, I had almost secondhand discomfort, because I know I was the kind of person growing up where like going to a setting like that would actually make me feel really uncomfortable. I was extroverted, but didn't really like party settings. So I felt genuine discomfort watching those scenes. It stood out to me quite a lot.
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to share my moment when I rewatched it. I actually applauded was at the one point where Ginger is trying to convince Bridget to turn herself into a werewolf so they can be together forever.
Yes.
And then later on in the film, she cuts her hand and decides to infect herself. And she turns to Ginger and she says, "Now I am you."
Yeah.
And then Ginger's like, "I know you are, but what am I?" And takes one of the cheesiest, most awful lines, like jokes from the 90s, from Wayne's World, and turns it into like the Shakespearean turn of phrase.
Yeah.
You know, that it's like this double meaning line. And I applauded after I heard that. I was like, that is some good screenwriting.
It really is.
That's a really clever line.
There's a deep sadness to these characters that you can't help but feel empathetic towards.
Now, before we move on to the last couple of questions I got here for you, is there anything else you want to add to this?
No, actually, that just about covers it up in terms of...
Really quickly, because I haven't actually seen the sequels.
Oh,
I never went around to it. I just, like I said, I guess I was busy at the time. I never got around to it. I'm curious about it now after revisiting. Are they worth watching?
Absolutely.
They are?
I actually think now, granted, I haven't seen the second one for a long time. That's going to be a revisit or a rewatch for me for sure, especially coming off on the heels of rewatching this one. But I immediately watched the second one because it was basically for rent at the same store at the time that I rented it.
Yeah.
Because it came out shortly afterwards, really. Like, it wasn't that much of a gap. I really liked the second one, and if I remember correctly, I liked the second one even more.
Well, you said it focuses on Bridget, and my big takeaway from that performance, I'm jumping at the chance to see more of her and that character.
She's terrific in the sequel, from what I remember. So I would love to cover that, like even in a later episode or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I want to do this podcast is to kind of see new stuff.
Sure.
You know, and the ability to talk about it.
Well, and something you may not know is the prequel that to speak of, because there was a third film in the trilogy.
Yeah, the third one's a prequel.
And it's a prequel in the highest sense, where it actually is like a period piece. It goes back to like 1600s.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and it brings back Catherine Isabel's character, and it's almost like reestablishing or rebuilding the lore of these two sisters and how they were like almost like connected through time.
Yeah, well, I mean, to tie it back to Cube, like, I unabashedly love Cube. Haven't seen any of the sequels. I've heard they aren't good. Fair. So that's one of the reasons why I haven't seen them. But if I had to, I would probably sit down and give them a watch if I had the time.
Sure, yeah.
But on that note, though, I think it's really awesome that from this movie that we did get more.
Yeah.
You know, and from it, you say that they're okay, and I'm looking forward to it. And yeah, I'm down to talk about them, actually, because I'm actually now, after revisiting this movie after almost 20 years, I'm kind of interested in diving into this world a bit more, and especially reading into the background of it. So just a final couple of questions here for you, Skylar.
Mm-hmm.
Ginger Snaps, what do you think that this film says about you? Okay. Like, not just you, but also like your influences and how it influences what you're doing today.
Right. Kind of a tough question to answer, but more or less what it says about me is, first of all, my interest in the movie and its connection to me personally growing up speaks a lot of volumes to an unwavering thing in me that refuses to die, which is a love for genre cinema specifically, because just by watching this one movie, it created almost like this chained effect where it led to me basically diving into all of the cinema that I've consumed today that I absolutely adore. Everything from like Cronenberg's work to Alien to a focus on practical effects in general, and my love of all of Del Toro's work. It's very much almost like a catalyst in a lot of ways.
Like ground zero.
It's ground zero, yeah.
Yeah.
And that's why it was really important for me to talk about this one, because it's kind of a representation in a lot of ways of an understanding of effects work in movie magic and how that has an effect on us and the production side of things. And then also on top of that, I guess it was a gateway for me to learn a little bit more about adolescence, myself at the time, and people around me, I guess, a self-awareness of people around me.
Well, I always like to think about it, and I always say that especially when you're in your early teens, like early to kind of mid-teens, the art that you consume and what you kind of take in literally becomes part of your DNA.
Yes.
You know, it is that integral of the makeup. I think it actually like chemically, molecularly alters us and has the ability to do it. And my final question for you, what do you think, because this is a this is a podcast about Canadian film, what do you think this film says about Canada? I mean, we already talked that it has a big overseas audience. What do you think people can learn about Canada from this film?
Oh my. I guess in regards to Canadian cinema, or I guess Canada in general, it shows and proves to everyone that with funding and an appropriate amount of talented people, we can pull off one kick-ass horror film, can actually accomplish quite a lot with very little, because the budget on this movie was not very large, and it has a quality and a finesse not unlike any American-made film, because when I watched this when I was younger, it never even crossed my mind that this was a Canadian-made movie. I guess that's kind of it.
No, I know I kind of threw that one at you, but I was kind of curious what your answer would be. Well, if that's okay, we're going to wrap things up here.
Excellent.
Thanks for being here. North of Normal is a production of Eldritch Creative. You can find them at Eldritch Creative on Facebook. You can find the show at North of Normal Pod on Facebook and North of Normal Pod on Instagram. Show music is by Dad vs. Son out of Hamilton, Ontario. Skylar, thank you so much for being here for this very first episode of North of Normal.
It was my pleasure. Absolutely loved it.
Awesome. See you around.